The Founding Fathers were affluent men, some of them slaveholders, and none of them had wives who had jobs. So they wrote a constitution for affluent men like themselves. As if in the spirit of Hallmark greeting cards, they used really exaggerated language, which they absolutely did not mean. The first words of the Constitution are, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." It sounds much grander than it was. We the people did not mean all the people in the place they were calling the United States. They were not including in We the People the members of all the tribes who were murdered or relocated to make room for these people in the We the People phrase. We the people did not mean women. We the people did not mean slaves. We the people only meant affluent men who wrote the phrase, "We the people." The founders created a Supreme Court that the founders assumed would be occupied by affluent men who would conduct themselves honorably with absolutely no supervision whatsoever needed at any time. And none of the Supreme Court justices would ever have wives with jobs. The founders certainly never expected a Supreme Court justice to have a husband because, of course, they never expected women to ever have the right to vote or the right to work in any of the jobs the founders were writing into the Constitution. Everything about Clarence Thomas's presence on the Supreme Court of the United States would shock the founders and offend many of them. It was inconceivable to them, of course, that the descendants of slaves could ever be members of the United States Supreme Court, but they would almost be equally shocked by the fact that Clarence Thomas has a wife who has a job. And that job is a serious ethical problem for the Supreme Court of the United States. Most members of the court know that, but they have been unable to do anything about it. Virginia Thomas is self-employed in a business that she created. We have no idea how much money she makes in that business, and we have no idea who pays her. In a marriage, money paid to a spouse is, in effect, money paid to both members of that marriage, especially if they both sign the same joint tax return. And so, in very real terms, we don't really know who's paying Clarence Thomas. That's the economic reality of the Thomas marriage, which takes in an unknown amount of money every year from unknown sources in an arrangement never envisioned by the Founding Fathers, and therefore remains beyond the system of so-called checks and balances that the founders thought they were creating. There is no check whatsoever on the ethics of the Supreme Court. In today's print edition of the Washington Post, an entire page is devoted to tracking 600,000 anonymously donated dollars to a group run by Ginny Thomas. How much of the $600,000 did she just take home herself? There's no way to know. She might not have taken any of that money home. She might have taken most of it home. The financing for the group was structured, the Washington Post reports, so that no one could ever know any of the salaries for anyone working for that group. The group was engaged in right-wing political activity, of course, because that is how Virginia Thomas spends her days, including her text to the last Trump White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, urging an illegal overturning of the last presidential election. As far as we know, based on the publicly available evidence, in the 234-year history of the United States Supreme Court, this may be, in the person of Clarence Thomas alone, the most corrupt Supreme Court in history. Or it may not be corrupt at all. There's certainly the appearance of huge conflicts of interest for the Supreme Court in the activities of Clarence Thomas and Clarence Thomas's wife. A lawyer for Virginia Thomas emailed some comments to the Washington Post for their expose on Virginia Thomas in the newspaper today, pulling $600,000 from anonymous sources. But before I read you the lawyer's email, let's just stop and consider where the Supreme Court is now, thanks to Clarence Thomas and Virginia Thomas, a Supreme Court justice's wife is being written about in the Washington Post, and that Supreme Court justice's wife has to hire a lawyer to respond to the story. That has never happened before in the history of the United States Supreme Court, not once. And here is what the first lawyer in history hired to respond to reporters about a Supreme Court justice's wife said, quote, "There is no plausible conflict of interest issue with respect to Justice Thomas." That is like saying there's no snow in Alaska. There is a very plausible conflict of interest issue with respect to Justice Thomas. We just don't know how bad it is, and we probably never will. And maybe Virginia Thomas told the truth when she testified to the January 6th committee that she has literally never once in her life discussed any Supreme Court case with her husband, ever. Maybe that's the truth. Today we discovered that, thanks to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, that the Supreme Court has been finally forced to take one small step from the darkness toward the light. Not into the light, just in the direction of the light, in the direction of transparency, but nowhere really close to it. This happened 2 weeks ago, but it was a secret until Senator Whitehouse received a letter last week from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts replying to questions that he has asked in his official capacity as a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee with jurisdiction over the courts, including the Supreme Court. Supreme Court justices are now going to have to, according to a report in today's Washington Post, quote, "provide a fuller public accounting of free trips, meals, and other gifts they accept from corporations or other organizations, according to revised regulations quietly adopted this month."